Колеги, доброго ранку усім. Розпочинаємо роботу в прес-центрі українського.
Good morning, dear listeners, and we now are holding the briefing, the press briefing on the 5th anniversary of the events on the Maidan, which is the name of the central square nowadays in Kiev. And we have among the participants, Yevhen Bystrytsky, the head of the Institute of Philosophy of National Academy of Sciences of Ukraine, Ms. Bekeshkina, director of the Democratic Initiatives Foundations, named after Ilko Kucheriv, Oleksiy Haran, research director of the Democratic Initiatives Foundation, and Oksana Kuzyakiv, executive director of the Center of Contemporary Society Studies, and Alexander who is the analyst, political analyst. So the floor is yours, dear panelists. Good morning, dear colleagues. As they say, you can only see the large things at a distance or from a distance. And as we now experience this highly politicized situation in Ukraine on the eve of the elections, some people might be biased by their political affiliations, but we nevertheless, as a think tank, as an analytical center, we tried to make an unbiased, objective survey of the public opinion in Ukraine. Although the public opinion is traditionally highly critical of Ukrainian authorities, of the government of Ukraine, we have today an opportunity to make comparisons of both the public opinion and the expert evaluations and assessments this year with those of the last year. And I would like to turn the floor over to Ms. Bekeshkina, who is the director of our Ilko Kucheriv Foundation. By the way, more than 80 experts, political experts, have been involved in this survey, in the production of this survey. So they both express themselves, their opinions as their expert opinions, and also their, so to say, civic positions. I'm going to be brief. It happened so that our expert evaluation in the recent years have been pretty consistent, and the negative and the positive results that turned out as a result of these surveys, they in essence have been repeating themselves, so to say. And if we look at the positive assessments and the consequences of the Maidan events, of these events of 2014, their positive evaluations have been also pretty consistent. The evaluation by the public of the reforms that have been completed since that time has been also consistent, and I would say, though, that the reforms that the citizens evaluated, to which they gave high marks, they were basically done in the first couple of years after these events that were even called by some people the revolution. And after that, there was a certain stagnation, which has continued up to now. As we look at the political forces, the civil society groups and forces that were formed a united, so to say, front during the Maidan events, they have since split. The majority of those polled and surveyed they consider these events to be positive, to be a victory for Ukraine. And Before that, we can say that more than 50% of the Ukrainians would usually associate themselves and their political and cultural affiliations with the East, with the Russian Federation. Now we can say that, according to our survey, the major part of the population is practically this gradation of the public opinion can be said as not clearly oriented, neither towards Russia nor towards any other geographical areas and countries. So we can now say that Maidan brought about some changes that people by now have become used to perceive as something that should pertain to, and have always pertained to their life, has been one of the features. Our survey was also focused on the civil society in Ukraine, and the feedback from the experts on civil society was such that if in 2014 the influence of the civil society on political processes in Ukraine grew significantly, after that it started fading gradually. So this is a trend that we would say a difficult one, if not dangerous, if we describe the relations between the society and the authorities in this country. Speaking about those expectations that have not been realized, have not been implemented, the expectations that people during those events expected, and this is a disappointing fact that they have not been implemented because, as we know, we have had the new president, the new parliament. Nevertheless, not all these expectations have been implemented. We also specifically polled the participants of the events of the Maidan. And they mostly focused on the lack of progress in the economic development of the country, and the lack of punishment of those who oppose them, so of the opposition. Among the other positive aspects mentioned by the police was the consolidation of what they described as the Ukrainian nation. And let me once again say that the majority of the trends described in our survey, or shown in our survey, or discovered in it, they manifested themselves in the first couple of years after the events of that Maidan. Among the negative trends is the loss of some territory of the former Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic. It lost it to Russia. And also a lot of people mention the significant deterioration of economic conditions, of the quality of life, of the level of life in this country. So we need to say that, probably to point out that some of these consequences were unintended consequences of the Maidan. The organizers were not willing to produce these exact consequences, but it so happened that there are these consequences now. Speaking about the possibility of the so-called second Maidan, the majority of the population consider it unnecessary and impossible, in fact. That's both the expert opinion, the opinion of the experts, and the opinion of the public at large. Also, we asked the public about the potential major civil unrest actions and manifestations and demonstrations and so forth, different other manifestations of civil unrest, the majority responded negatively, that they are not likely, not probable. Another question, important question in my view, was what should be done in order to achieve those goals that were set during these events. The first, the major part of the respondents highlighted the importance of the completion of the judiciary reform, the struggle against corruption in this country, and it also coincided with the expert opinion, the opinion of the experts. And I remember clearly that Mr. Nayem, one of the MPs, who was one of the organizers of the Maidan events, he said that now Maidan is transferred, after these events, it is transferred into the parliament of Ukraine. And so we can leave it at that, with this acknowledgement of the fact that the Parliament of Ukraine has, all the political developments are centered on the Parliament of Ukraine. Let me now turn the floor over to Mr. Bystrytsky, who has been long in this polling business. I'm sure that he could make a quick summary. Yes, indeed, I would like to say a few words summarizing these trends of the last 5 years, because 5 years is an anniversary that is quite important. I'm not going to speak about the beginning of the Maidan events. But I would rather say that we need to speak about 5 years of the self-isolation, so to say, of the authorities of the government and the ruling classes of this country from the rest of the society. Let us remember how it happened, what it all happened. This protest that we later called the Maidan protest, which is an Arabic word meaning the plaza, so to say, the square of the city. There were two. This upheaval, initial upheaval, was quickly split into two parts, we can say. One part of the protesters that in that split was clearly indicating that they were against all the authorities existing in Ukraine at that time, not only against Mr. Yanukovych's administration. Then what happened was that some new, or rather not new, but different politicians, different from who were not part of Mr. Yanukovych's administration, they penetrated, so to say, this Maidan protest, and although not all of them took part in organizing, in leading these protests, gradually, what happened was what I would say a peak, a breaking point of the situation when you can see a leader, a representative of the newly emerging authorities, speak from a bulldozer to the crowd of people. Why am I saying that? Because in my view, Maidan set out a sort of a principle that continue probably haunting this new government. It's the need for cooperation between the civil society and the government, which is obviously lacking. And what has happened since was that there were the new elections in Ukraine, the new president was elected, the new parliament was elected, and the new government was appointed. And as these new governing structures are in place, they probably are expected to do some reforms. And But for that, they need to have a vision of these reforms, some outlook of what needs to be done, at least some indicators, some benchmarks. And here we have the experts, who, by the way, some of them participated in these events, who would call this vision some policy. It should be shaped out into a policy. And they emphasized during the Maidan the need to make these reforms pro-European, or at least based on some European values and so on. But how to do them, these reforms, and what these reforms should be. And here we have this need again for cooperation between the civil society and the government. And here I can say a few words from my own experience. For example, we could have Ukrainian experts involved in, together jointly with the ministries and new ministers, developing the plans, these policies of reforms. What's important? And it was a good luck, I think, of Ukraine's that until now there have been probably a dozen, if not 24, analytical centers in Ukraine, Ukrainian analytical centers, who were capable, in my view, to develop these policies, these plans. My view is that Ukraine is a very talented country with very talented people. Only political will should be in order to involve them. And one of these working groups, joint produce, so to say, of the government and the analytical centers was created right here, and it resulted in this Ukrainian Crisis Media Center. It was specifically created in order to present the successes of the reforms to the public. But what happened next was the decentralization reform, and it was developed by some outside experts, not Ukrainian experts. I'm not aware of who they were. The reform of the government and self-government, specifically the local authorities, local system, the system of the local government, the education system, reform, the healthcare system reform, and the reform of the energy sector, power generation sector and distribution, which resulted, by the way, in the reformation of this regulatory body that had existed but was reformed later on. Although there was a number of councils created at the presidency, so the president could communicate with the members of the public or with the civil society, and so the structures for this dialogue, they have been organized, they have been established, but as soon as the implementation stage of the reforms started, approximately spring of 2016, because in 2014 the discussions only started about the reforms, what reforms were needed. In 2015 they were developed. And in 2016, as soon as these reforms started to be implemented, this dialogue between the government and the public society started fading away, so to say. Certainly there are some visits of the MPs, of the members of the government, to different sittings and meetings of these councils with the participation of both the government and the public and the public at large. A good example of this stagnation of these contacts if not even a direct movement against them, was the introduction of electronic declarations, electronic tax returns. And these competitions among different factions in the ruling circles of Ukraine, they end up in things like killing of the activists, like what we witnessed recently with Ms. Ganzuk, who was killed recently, who died recently. And again, we come here to this problem also showcased by this survey of the lack of trust of the Ukrainian public to its government. And here we have the reasons of this mistrust. So this lack of contacts. It's not only about the public communication between the authorities with the public. There are the press conferences, the briefings, and so on. But what I mean by public communication is some permanent forms of interaction between the government and the society. If something happens that is of concern, of public concern, the politicians or the government officials should speak in front of the public, explaining their positions, explaining their views on how to, on the best ways out of this, of any difficult situation. And so the lack of this, what I call public communication, is probably one of the main problems in this interaction between the government and the civil society. What prevents this interaction? Well, when one starts communicating with the public or tries to communicate with the public, he or she, this public official, should be open, should be transparent, should be able to speak openly to the public. And here we have this problem that brings about these deficiencies in intercommunication, or rather lack of it, oftentimes, between the government and government officials and the public at large. So we can now look at the options that we have in the upcoming elections, and again, I'm desperate. I'm in seeing the mistrust of the public to all the potential public officials in this country. Well, I would probably tell you a paradoxical thing, but I would say that one of the results of these events was that the authorities didn't create, but they somehow eliminated the conditions for the existence of any democratic opposition in this country. There is no democratic opposition to the existing government, or at least it is suppressed. So that this mistrust of the public to the government has grown to a significant extent. Therefore, I am not quite optimistic vis-à-vis the next elections. Well, certainly a lot has been said, a lot of things that has been disputed, are debatable. For example, this last idea that you expressed about the democratic opposition, the democratic opposition should find its own ways, unite themselves somehow. Yes, certainly they should, but the conditions for their activities could be conducive or not. And that's what I wanted to highlight. Now, the floor is Mr. Kuzyakina's. The executive director of the Institute of Economic Research and Political Consultations. Well, I'm going to dwell upon the economic dimension of these events 5 years ago and economic reforms I heard the beginning of today's meeting of the Verkhovna Rada. They transmitted it on TV, and I heard just passing by the initial parts of the speech of one of the MPs, of the members of parliament of Ukraine. He mentioned some economic indicators. For example, and that's why I would like to also start with economic indicators. For example, the GDP growth for the last year was 2.5%, which is not bad, generally speaking. And if we look also at the results of economic reforms, let us also take into account the economic conditions in 2014 when these events happened. I might say that the last stage of these stagnation, economic developments that can be characterized as stagnation, that stage started yet again in 2012. And before that, as we all know, there was a large crisis, economic and financial crisis of 2008, 2012, and that was accompanied by the huge drop, so to say, reduction of the GDP by probably 20 to 25%. And all these events also, all these negative economic developments, they also brought about the growth of corruption after 2012 and the reduction, the decrease of production, of industrial production started growing. And for example, responding to one of the questions in your survey about the consequences, economic consequences or impact of the Maidan, it came to my mind that the philosophical, so to say, maxim that whatever happens after an event is not necessarily a consequence of that event. May be just a coincidence. Today's economic difficulties I might attribute not only to these events at Maidan in 2014, but also to the other economic parameters and conditions, like, for example, the shortage of funds and the deficit, public funds, and the deficit of the public budget. And we can say that some of the economic reforms in Ukraine in 2014 were done in the conditions of this struggle against against the hostilities in the east of Ukraine. And so the measures aimed at macroeconomic stability that we are now talking about all the time in the press, and the government speaks about them, it's not about stimulating the development of the economy. It's a mere stabilization approach. And this is important to remember when we assess economic situation in this country. Another aspect is the other problems with the disfigured system of taxation in Ukraine, what people called, some experts were calling the taxation holes, and so on. All these negative aspects, together with rampant corruption, there were the attempts to fight against them. For example, I heard of the figure of 3.6 billion hryvnias which would be a few dozen $1 million that were recovered in the course of that struggle over the last years. Another aspect, for example, when 3 years ago we surveyed the businesses' reactions and attitudes to the economic conditions in the country, they still were mentioning such problems as the reimbursement of the VAT, of the value-added tax, or sales tax, as it's called in different countries. Now these problems have been resolved, and so we can say that because of due to some harsh conditions and a lot of or much needed institutional changes that have not yet been completed. All these things, all these aspects, they make this process of economic reformation quite lengthy. So we can say that these reforms are not a one-day reform. A lot of questions about the competencies, like people who are in the government and at the same time they have their own private businesses. How can these things be combined, and whether they are good for the country. All that means that the pace of economic reform is not that quick, is not as quick as we would like it to be. But at the same time, let me underline that such an important reform as deregulation and here we have one of the most painful problems for the businesses in Ukraine. This gradually has been alleviated. This problem has been gradually alleviated. Deregulation has been progressing, and for example, the percentage of businesses who still say they suffer from this regulatory burden is only about 20%. In the previous years, it was much higher. This percentage was much higher. Also, the conditions for indirect investments into Ukrainian economy improved, and so.
When we are speaking about economic behavior and the behavior in the economic area, the predictability of the environment is important, the conditions are important, and elections and political turbulence that we expect in the next year of elections, it creates a situation when business will wait, because this happens in time of elections, not only in Ukraine. It happens when there is situation of when unpredictable situations arise. So I would like to say that during these 5 years, economic reforms, they really moved from the starting point. The speed is not good, but they started, and this is important. And if you go to the street and look at life of people in the cities and in oblast centers, and you may come to your own conclusion, but life didn't become worse. We are moving forward, and the improvement depends on us, whether we are ready for change, both officials and businessmen. Thank you, Oksana. We thank you for this focus on economic reform, because this is really important in the context of our political struggle, when on TV and in communication strategy of the power that doesn't provide proper information. But some people say that everything is not good, but we see positive changes in institutions and in the sphere of economy, and there are some objective indicators that show these changes, and also there is perception, subjective perception of people, and here there is a gap. And once again, I would like to stress that I'm grateful to Oksana, because she brought attention to the correlation between Maidan and consequences. Economic drop during first years is not related to Maidan, and I didn't choose this option. And when I answered this question, and only 16 out of 80 experts, they supported this idea. Only 16% said that the Maidan resulted in economic drop, and this is the minority of experts who said so. So on the front page, we should state that these are some experts, not all experts. We said that experts say, but only some experts say. 16 out of 80 experts say so. So thank you that you've mentioned this. Please pay attention to this. Now I give the floor to Alexander, and he is going to tell us about problems of corruption. So do we have positive changes in this area? Yes, there are changes. You succeeded to build the most open corruption in the world. This was said by one of the participants of international conference. So we have open registers, e-declaration of officials. That is a big change compared with what we had. If we compare it with the printed declarations or handwritten declarations, there was no proper access to these declarations for the public. There was no responsibility for lying in declaration. Also, there is a creation of anti-corruption bureau, and it provided charges to some officials, and also we see that the aim of the power was declared by the government. This goal of fighting corruption, it is not well reflected in the Index of Transparency International. There we add 1 or 2 scores, and this movement is really slow. And there are some grounds for this, and we see that there is impunity of officials, and there is no proper judicial court system, and this creates obstacles to move forward. So also corruption is believed one of the biggest problems, and court system is not able to counteract. And we see that NABU cases, they also are not considered by courts during long time, and there are many cases like this. And we see that electronic declarations that are stored, and the register continues operation, but they are not verified properly, and the body that should have provided for this is Agency for Corruption Prevention. It doesn't function properly as it was expected at the beginning of the creation of this body. And as Iryna said, fight against corruption, this was one of the biggest requests of the public in times of Maidan. Also, we see that we needed 2 years in order to adopt the law on anti-corruption court in the edition that was agreed with our international experts. And also we see the process concerning selection of candidates, and now organizations of civil society call on proper selection, and they see the gaps and in the process. And also we see that a lot was not done, and taking into account that we lack the law on disclosure of information to protect those people, to disclose corrupt officials, and some people informed about corrupt actions, but they are not protected, and activists are pressured, especially in the regions. And we see that NABU, they do not have proper responsibilities. For example, they need the right to wiretap, and draft law on this is in Verkhovna Rada for a long time, and coalition they are not able to vote for this draft law to provide this opportunity for NABU. Also, we see that some registers, despite they are open, they are not full. And also, automatic system of verification of declarations. It is not launched, and because of absence of access, and this is one more problem that was not regulated properly, and this verification this is really important for the proper functioning. Not only the presence of declaration is important, they should be properly checked. And we see that NAZK needs reloading, and law enforcement bodies, they often abuse their right of interference into business activities, and we see it in recent scandals and in the news, in the media. These bodies, they have improper functions like SBU and they interfere in economic activities. And also we see that there is a big potential for digitalization and in interaction of business and fiscal services, or digitalization in the new spheres of interaction of the state, Prozoro sale, e-health. So there are spheres where quality cooperation is needed, and also there shouldn't be opposition of the officials of newly created law enforcement bodies. You heard the recent news in this area. Unfortunately, it influences the perception of corruption and the perception of anti-corruption bodies. So a lot should be done in fighting corruption, and we still have a lot of work in this fifth year in the sphere of fighting corruption. I would like to say several words on this. When we are speaking about the 5th anniversary of Maidan and about the assessment of Maidan, here we see two directions. The first one is historic place of Maidan, and I believe that here there is no big difference in opinions on this. This is believed to be important event, a revolution that played one of the key role in the change for Ukraine, and it gave a drive for Ukraine that we feel, and we will continue to feel this drive further on. So, and the second direction is that Maidan became the driver for change, and here we should do really a lot in order to implement those requirements of Maidan. And when we are speaking about the fact that Maidan was the movement for, or the movement against, we believe that this was the movement against the power that existed at the time, but also this was a movement for. So when we read the requirements of Maidan that were formed at the time, there are things that would be, can be clearly identified as a movement for. And here are things that are done or not done. Not done are the requirements of Maidan on open party lists. And we see that this is not done, and we don't believe that it will be done before parliamentary elections. At the same time, one of the requirements of Maidan was political reform and return to constitutional reform of 2004. And this changed the character of the constitutional design, and we understand that now we do not have the president with too broad responsibilities, and his responsibilities are limited, and this is good. And the system of power, constitutional power, is really balanced. And when they say about monopolization of power and movement towards this monopolization, I see another problem. The problem is that even if the power wants to do the right thing, it is forced to search for the support in the parliament, and they do not always have this support, because this is a situational support. There is coalition that lacks votes, and they should search for allies. And here there is a problem. Once again, I see this problem not in monopolization of power, but mainly in the ability to implement effectively adopted decisions, because there is political opposition and there is no proper support in the parliament. Speaking about what was done and the successes, the most evident are in the sphere of foreign policy, and here association agreement was mentioned, and visa-free regime also was mentioned, and we may add decrease of dependability on Russia, and because over with Russia fell 3 times, there was some increase. There is a lot of speculation on this, that it increases. But if we compare with previous times, it fell. It was about 10 or 12%, and the part of the European Union increased up to 40%. And also we are less dependent on Russia in energy sphere. We get gas from European direction, and technically we understand this is Russian gas that goes to Europe and then it comes to us, but this is the result of the energy market in the European Union, and we buy directly not from Russia but from European partners. So maybe when we are speaking about the territory of Ukraine, but this is also the transit for our European partners. About corruption. Once again, we may say about what my colleagues said. This is absolutely right, and we may say that there is decrease of corruption in some areas. This is Naftogaz system and the system and Prozoro system, and also new institutions are being created. Yes, we have a lot of concerns about them, but these institutional changes are ongoing and they will provide their effect. Now people do not feel this, and there is big criticism and opposition. And I would like to remind you the selection for anti-corruption court, and this process is going on, and there is a struggle for what this institution will be, and we criticize the actions of power, and when we fight it, we should be in the legislative area. So the head of the commission who selects the candidates, he was he was filled with this iodine liquid. What about the actions of people who are involved in the process, and what about the responsibility for these actions? We studied together at the faculty, at the legal faculty, and I do not want to face the situation like he faced, and I hope that I won't be in his shoes. Freedom of speech. When you read international assessments and you see the ratings of Ukraine compared with previous years, when they deteriorate, when we speak about Yanukovych's time, and when we compare the situation, some international experts say that Russian channels are cut, or there is limited access to social media from Russia, or we ban the arrival of some Russian journalists, and this way they try to prove that freedom is limited in Ukraine, and I believe that it doesn't reflect the situation because we should take into account Russian aggression, and in conditions of war, the level of freedoms in Ukraine, including media freedom, this level is really high. And you just turn on TV or radio, and you may hear all this. So I believe that there is a lot of freedom. I do not see limitations. I see this Ukrainian siege, Ukrainian atamanshina, and I believe that it so this is not about oligarchic market. I believe that journalism standards dropped, and the level of non-professionalism, it increases. So this total openness, unfortunately, resulted in worsening of the situation. This is not only about oligarchic channels, but also this is about channels that we believe to be democratic or channels of public TV. So I believe that this is not only about money. So the journalists should be prepared. They should be educated. If you are not qualified, do not comment on some topics. When I'm asked to some events to comment, I say, for example, I'm not a specialist in this. So you may, for example, comment as a person, not as an expert. Some channels just invite you and ask about different things, and I say I'm not competent in some issues and I won't comment on this. I'm not in the trend. I just want to comment on what I understand properly. So this is my subjective view, but I'm for freedom. I'm against returning to the times of media limitations that existed in the times of Yanukovych. Also about the unification of democratic politicians. this is not about the words of Ivan Konstantinovich. We may analyze the situation that appeared after Maidan. We see that people we hoped for, people who were active on Maidan, who were active in civil society, who represented healthy wing in different parties. Did they unite after Maidan? No, they didn't. They went along. They were in different parties' lists, and when we asked them about unification, they said we had a 5% threshold, and there was no guarantee that this new force may overcome this barrier. That's why we were included in the lists of other parties. And the result is that we do not have clear pro-reformist union, and it was not created in 2014, and unfortunately, Samopomich, it didn't meet our requirements, and now this problem continues to exist before parliamentary elections, and there are many politicians who say right things, and they have reformist views, but they are not united, and if they are not united, we cannot say about unfavorable political situation, or they do not have access to media, but you may use opportunities that you have, and for this you need to get united. I believe that there is a lot of work ahead, and we should have requirements to power, and also we should have requirements to activists and those people, and to experts, to us and to those people who want to be the new word in Ukrainian politics. So we have some time for questions, please. Dear colleagues, please.
Roman Kucharuk, Nacia Information Agency. I have a question to Mr. Bystrytsky. Next year there will be 30 years since Mr. Sherbitsky shot himself. Are you sure he did? It's in Mr. Wróblewski's memoirs. For how long do you think Ukraine is going to continue to exist in this Soviet paradigm, so to say? And what do you think if about the possibility of the democracy being anti-Ukrainian, and what the Ukrainians should do about such democracy? I'm not Sherbitsky, I'm Bystrytsky. In my view, from the very beginning, when the Soviet Union broke up or fell apart, Ukraine emerged right away as the national democracy. That's my answer. Well, in my view, it's an important issue. Democracy can be liberal, and the non-democratic forces can come to power using democracy. Therefore, I am sure that, for example, if we speak about today's situation in Ukraine, I am of the opinion that there will be no, at least openly pro-Russian candidate elected at the next elections. But if you look at all the candidates, none of them has even the ratings of the Party of the Regions of the previous president, Mr. Yanukovych. His Party of the Regions, that's the fact of life today. But the increase of some, for example, coalition of the parties, some of them might be pro-Russian. They can increase their presence in the parliament. And I also ask myself what we as the Ukrainians should do. And here I come, as an historian, I come to the historical parallels of the period of the civil war in Russia, as a result of which Ukraine was split from Russia, and there were the instances when there was Hetman Skoropadsky, the head of the country, who was brought to power by the Germans, and the previous governments that were also brought to power by central powers of the time, and how it can all be, evaluated and looked at, and whether it transpires to our modern day situation. Well, your question about populism, I think, is a multifaceted question, because you mentioned the populism that is also, parades as or masquerades, so to say, as the Russian populism or pro-Russian populism. But we have also different other types of populisms, like strictly nationalist populism, and so on, and the other options. There will be there will be an event that we organize, where we are going to discuss these prospects for the future elections, and I invite you to participate. We can call it, my view is that we can call it a background noise, so to say. Like, for example, it happens in many countries. You have the halls, conference halls, and concert halls full of people debating something, discussing something, but not discussing the key issues or the issues that might be considered more important. For example, in our context, in Ukrainian context, it's about one of these issues could be the authorities vested in the president of the country. That's my view, and I agree with Oleksiy in his rather harsh assessment of the media in our country. This system of media coverage in this country is now constructed or devised so that it's difficult for anyone to present any balanced, points of view. And the other thing is also that for the smaller TV channels, for example, and media companies, it's already quite difficult to compete with the large ones, like 1+1 TV channel, or Inter TV channel, or Ukraina TV channel, or ICTV, and the others. Although, certainly, if some resources are available, a lot of facts, a lot of opinions could be presented by the media in a rather interesting, vivid way. And I would like to now inform you that we are working on formulating what we call the agenda for the President of Ukraine. It, in our view, needs to include both the authorities and functions of the President, and also his duties and rights. We, I think, need this as a country in order to at least somehow raise the level of awareness of the public at large about the importance of these presidential elections, and to put it into the context of more or less, really political context rather than emotional context. I would like to add that yes, we need to, if we say A, we need to say B. But oftentimes it happens so that with our reforms, we start them, and then we soon abandon them. Or the other option, or the other sort of development is when bad regulations are created and developed instead of good ones, and thus this is presented, or rather mispresented, as reforms. And that's the situation with a lot of regulations here in Ukraine, like technical regulations and some policies and so on. I think that in this area we also need some changes if we want to improve our quality of life, our level of life. And as I have already mentioned, it's a long-term process. It cannot happen overnight. I would agree. Certainly, populism that you mentioned is a problem, but populism is not something that the politicians themselves generate, politicians alone. They, in this way, reply to the demand of the society. For example, in 1999, when Mr. Kuchma put his candidacy for the next term in the presidential elections, it was particularly vivid that these elections were, as has been the case since that time, in Ukraine it has been this, so to say, the auction of promises. Who promises more and who makes better promises? As long as the society grows up and its members become the adults, and they, unless they stop believing into the fables and this tendency of populism is going to continue. It's not only the promises, and it's not only the populism, but it's oftentimes outright kickbacks and other ways of corruption in place. We have seen already the attempts to destroy these electronic tax returns, electronic tax declarations, as they are called in Ukraine, or tax forms that were supposed to be filled in and presented electronically, and a lot of other things in a lot of other spheres. So all that, ladies and gentlemen, is to say that we need to make a right choice at the next presidential elections. Do we have any more time, any more questions? If not, thank you very much for your attention, and see you next time.